The cab dropped me off in front of Evermere House. I should have picked a regular hotel. That was my first thought when I stepped out of the cab and looked up at the towering Victorian mansion, its dark windows reflecting the moonlight. It definitely wasn't your typical B&B. I clutched my overnight bag and checked my phone. 10:23 p.m. The business meeting in this small town had dragged on longer than expected. Now all I wanted was to get to bed so I could wake up early for departure. Mrs. Whitaker, the owner, had been kind enough to arrange a last-minute stay when all other inns were full. The elderly woman had been very clear about what I should expect when I called. You may use the sitting room, the dining area, and your bedroom, but only the ground floor, dear. The upper floors are closed. No one goes up there anymore. I didn't ask why and didn't care, since I would only be staying the night and would be gone by morning. Inside, the house smelled of aged wood and lavender. It felt very cozy despite being so old. A single lamp was left on in the hallway, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. There was a note waiting for me on the dining table. Your room is at the end of the hall. The doors to the upper floors are locked. Breakfast would be at 6:30. Sleep well. I briefly wondered where she was staying, but shook off that thought and focused on what I needed to do. It had been a long day, and I just needed a few hours of sleep before catching my train in the morning. My room was small but comfortable, an old oak bed, a narrow window overlooking the overgrown garden, and a wardrobe in the corner that groaned when I shut it. I quickly changed, washed up, turned off the light, and climbed into bed. I was about to doze off when I heard something that jolted me awake. It sounded like a soft shuffle from the hallway. It wasn't the house settling or the wind. It was movement. Someone, or something, was in the hallway. I held my breath, listening. The sound was slow, deliberate, just beyond my door. My first thought was, Mrs. Whitaker, maybe checking on me. But I hadn't heard a door open, and she had vaguely mentioned something about her own quarters at the back of the house somewhere. The room was dimly lit from the glow of the street lamp outside, and I looked at the door to see it slightly open. I am sure I locked it and checked it twice to be sure. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see a sliver of the hallway through the slight gap in my doorway. I didn't hear anything again, but as I silently waited, I saw a figure peering from the dimly lit hallway outside. Tall, gaunt, its head tilted unnaturally as if studying me. The figure had no discernible features, just a pale, elongated face, the eyes swallowed in shadow. And then it moved soundlessly, drifting past the doorway and deeper into the house. I sat up too fast, heart pounding. I wanted to believe I had imagined it, but I knew what I saw. Every hair on my body stood on end. I immediately jumped off the bed and rushed to the door and locked it. I also shoved a coffee table against it that was somewhat heavy. I then grabbed my phone and called Mrs. Whitaker with shaking hands. I waited anxiously and kept glancing at the door, half expecting to hear something on the other side. She finally answered after several rings. Hello? Her voice was groggy, thick with sleep. She definitely wasn't in the hallway just now, and that terrified me more. Mrs. Whitaker, I'm sorry to wake you, but I saw someone in the hallway outside my door, just standing there. For a moment, I thought the call had dropped. Then, in a quieter voice, she said, It's just the house, dear. No, please believe me. I know what I saw. I insisted, annoyed at being dismissed. She sighed. I understand you're frightened, but you don't need to be. It only watches. That's all. I felt cold all over. Yes. Her voice was too calm. I promise, it won't harm you. It never has. Just go back to bed, dear. I'm in my quarters at the back. You're perfectly safe. I wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but something in her tone told me that was all I was going to get, and I felt slightly relieved knowing she was nearby. Okay. Try to get some rest, she said gently, then hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening, but the house was silent. I didn't know what to make of what I saw, and I felt less panicked after talking to Mrs. Whitaker, who didn't seem concerned by it. It was almost 1 a.m, and I had to endure just a few more hours. I left the lamp on, curled up under the blanket, and forced myself to stay awake as long as I could. I am fairly certain I heard footsteps from the floors above. But hadn't Mrs. Whitaker said no one lived up there? Whatever it was, rats, wind, an old house playing tricks, I would be gone in a few hours. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I startled awake just as the morning light was beginning to stream through the window. As I got up, I noticed the wardrobe door was open just an inch, but I remember closing it. I stared at the darkness within, and in the faint morning light, I saw something. A figure half hidden in the wardrobe's shadows. The shape in the wardrobe was not standing, it was hanging. A woman's body, suspended by the neck, its face eerily calm. Its eyes were open, watching me. I screamed my lungs out as I frantically jumped off the bed and moved to reach the door, fumbling to shove the coffee table away. My hands shook as I wrenched the door open, nearly colliding with Mrs. Whitaker as she burst in, her face creased with worry. I told her what I saw, but by that time the inside of the wardrobe was empty. I stared at her, waiting for an explanation, for any reaction beyond mild concern. But she simply patted my shoulder and said, "It happens sometimes. Nothing to be afraid of." I made her sit in my room while I hurriedly threw my things into my bag and got ready as quickly as I could. Mrs. Whitaker reminded me that breakfast was ready, but I declined without hesitation, stepping out into the cold morning air. I just needed to leave. I stood at the end of the driveway waiting for my Uber and looked back at the house to see a woman in the top window watching. Mrs. Whitaker followed my gaze and sighed, apologizing, saying such sightings, as she put it, was normal in the house and harmless. I was still shaken and said nothing. Later, out of morbid curiosity, I searched the house online. A woman had hanged herself in that house years ago. The grainy old photo attached to the story made my stomach twist, because the room she died in, it was the one I had stayed in. Her husband followed soon after, taking his own life upstairs. I still shiver at the memory of that night, the way her eyes watched me. And I know one thing for certain, I will never stay at a B&B again.